Good evening, everyone. I'm Bruno Dous, president of the EUI, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this 2023 edition of the Ursula Hirschmann lecture, which is now a well-established tradition within the Institute, organized jointly by the History Department and the Robert Schuman Center for a number of years, and it's always a great opportunity to, well, of course, celebrate a great character who was both a great European and a leading feminist in the middle of the 20th century, but also a great opportunity for us to hear interesting feminist perspective on a number of issues. And in that respect, we are, of course, very happy to welcome Professor Hozić. Today, I must say that much to my regret, I will not be able to stay for her lecture because I have last-minute duties that will distract me, but I want to stress that we're all extremely happy to have you here with us. It's a great honor and a privilege for the Institute, and I hope that you will get as much from this event that I'm sure the rest of the audience will. So thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you once again for finding time to come down and join us in person.
So I am going to take the role of chairing. My name is Lauren Casella. I'm a professor of the history of science here at the EUI, and I am the Dean for Equality, Diversity, and Inclusiveness. It's a huge pleasure to welcome Aida Hozić here. And I'm going to give you a fulsome introduction. And I should say, to her the credit of her modesty, Aida said to me, please don't give a fulsome introduction, but I have said this event is important and she is important, and you are going to sit here next to me and blush while I tell you about her achievements. She's an associate professor of international relations at the University of Florida in Gainesville. Her research is situated at the intersections of feminist political economy, cultural studies, and international security. Her current research projects focus on crime and state in Southeastern Europe, visual representations of race in international politics, and the diffusion of global arts markets in the 21st century. She's the author of Holly World, Space, Power, and Fantasy in the American Economy. Sorry, I've lost my notes. She's co-editor with Jackie True of Scandalous Economics, Gender and Politics of Financial Crisis. She has written dozens of peer-reviewed articles and chapters in edited volumes. Her work has been supported by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, IREX, Institute for Turkish Studies, Open Society Institute. She's had multiple Fulbright Awards and many other fellowships. She's currently a co-lead editor of Review of International Political Economy and a rotating editor-in-chief of International Political Sociology. Her public writing has appeared on the pages of Slate, Foreign Policy, Politico, Al Jazeera, Le Monde, Guernica, and other media. In the spring of 2023, she has been a distinguished professor of political and international relations at Pembroke College, Oxford. And today, she's going to talk under the title Feminist Political Economy of War and Peace, which, as we all know, is even more regrettably present as a topic than it was when I think she gave us this title. So over to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And thank you everyone for coming. I see some familiar faces here, so I'm very grateful that you could all find the time to come. And I know there are people on Zoom, so thanks to everyone who's joining us over Zoom. I want also to thank Beno Gamer and Eric Jones, Department of History and the Robert Schuman Center, for inviting me here to the EUI. And I also want to thank Francesca Parenti, who has left us, and her team for organizing the logistics of my visit. It's always truly an incredible honor to be here in Fiesole. But it is a special honor, I think, and a privilege to give a talk in this annual series of lectures, which is named after Ursula Hirschmann. We are all indebted to her for her courage, for her passions, for her work on creating a united Europe and a Europe that also speaks to women. But we are also in debt to her immediate and kind of larger extended family, to Hirschmann's, Colorni, Spinelli, Pontecorvo, Sen, and especially to her 6 daughters. Their lives were, and they continue to be, dedicated to projects of political and economic justice, and centered on the people senza patria, deracine, stateless, as Ursula Hirschmann always identified herself. And it is this stateless and feminist sense, I think, and I would argue today, which is the perspective that I think we read right now in this very dangerous and violent moment for Europe and for the world. And so at this point, I will try to attempt to do a sharing of the PowerPoint presentation, which I'm not completely, is it already there? Okay, perfect. No? Okay, yes, yes. So I will return to Ursula Hirschmann in my conclusion. My talk today is a set of preliminary notes for a book manuscript which is entitled Follow the Bodies, Feminist Political Economy of War and Peace. The manuscript builds on almost 2 decades of research and writing about conflicts and post-conflicts, conflict and post-conflict economy, illicit trade, feminist political economy of crisis, and feminist international political economy of wars and liberal interventionism. Although explicitly feminist in its orientation, the book and today's talk do not focus on women only. My understanding of identities, gendered, racial, ethnic, class, is always fluid. I see them as structures that can rule over our lives, but also as fictions. Their role in politics can be both of longue durée and malleable. Therefore, I look at the interplay of identities with other structures and political actors, using the lens and the methods of feminist political economy, aiming to make the invisible visible. This is an ambitious project. I wish to tackle the tensions and the contradictions of contemporary global political economy, which I believe haunt many of us. The commingling and coexistence of infinite wars, perpetual crisis, misogyny, and racism, with the simultaneous expansion of gender rights, calls for decolonization and anti-racism. I don't see these political struggles as ideological culture wars or as cover-ups for material inequalities. I see them as entwined and emblematic of the world in which cascading wars, crisis, and violence represent an integral part of the global political economy. I argue that we live in an era of merchant capitalism with its very distinct regime of accumulation, which thrives on instabilities, which also demands violence to secure itself, and which operates with a gendered and racial logic, which is very different from industrial capitalism. Europe is just a dot in that world, engulfed in competition over trade routes, ports and maritime flows, resources, checkpoints, and essential commodities. It is a world dominated by very manly elites, willing to scorch the earth in order to preserve themselves. And Europe is also an aging continent, dependent on bodies of others for its own self-reproduction. Therefore, these are deadly times. And if Europe is to survive, I think, it must learn how to look at itself from the outside, from its peripheries, from the global south, and through the eyes of those who are excluded. In order to make these links and the operations of merchant capital apparent and intelligible, I suggest that we need to follow bodies rather than money or states, as we usually do in international political economy. By following bodies, not just money and not only states, we begin to see refugees, mercenaries, care workers, soldiers, body parts, aging seniors, fetuses and surrogate mothers, and a variety of international experts and expats who are in perpetual transit as they go in and out of these war zones. These monetized and weaponized movements of people and of these feminized and racialized bodies, once it's made visible, allows us to trace the circuits of violence which feed and then feed off the economies of war and peace. These bodies in motion, Jackie True and I suggested in a special issue of Review of International Political Economy, represent the real currency of contemporary capitalism. But they also enable us, I will suggest in conclusion, to engage in thinking about alternatives to the violent politics in war economies that we now take for granted. And given the acceleration of cascading wars and crises, the urgency of considering such alternatives, I think, cannot be overstated. So there are several building blocks tonight in this talk. To clarify what following the bodies bring to international political economy and security studies, I will first contrast traditional understandings of war and peace in international politics with their feminist counterparts and interpretations. I will then introduce the concept of merchant capitalism and discuss its gendered and racialized aspects, its links to violence, and its crucial role in integrating war and peace. I will move between macro-historical and systemic analysis of capitalism and micro-histories and individual narratives. And I will go back and forth into the past and debates about the origins of capitalism, and also attempt to look forward beyond this inextricable and normalized link between wars, crisis, capitalism. Throughout, I will retain a peripheral perspective. I will look at Europe from its margins, focusing mostly on the Balkans and Ukraine. But I will always have a view on the global circuits of capital and violence beyond Europe and beyond the West. So let me first unpack this very dense set of thoughts by introducing you to a body connecting across time two European war zones: Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was the site of genocide in the 1990s, and Ukraine, the terrain of the current warfare for the future of Europe, as we are told. In 2004, the war was over. In the post-conflict Bosnia and Herzegovina, where international peacekeepers were guarding the de facto protectorate, a young Ukrainian woman died in Mostar, a city which is to this day, as in the 1990s, divided between the Bosnian Muslim and Croat communities. This young woman, her name was Olena Popic, was only 21. After she died, a pathologist who examined her corpse said that he had never seen a more diseased body in his entire career. Wherever I cut the body open, the pathologist said, I found at least one disease, and all of them were so advanced that much of her insides had decomposed. There was a collection of the deadliest diseases in the world lying on the table: AIDS, hepatitis C, tuberculosis, and syphilis, among others. Olena was dropped on the stairs of a hospital in Mostar by a Bosnian man whose name was Dženan Golić, who had, as it was later discovered, received her as a gift from her previous pimp, who was a Croat. She had previously worked in Serbia, Slovenia, and in Bosnia. And before she died, she told her doctors that she would often serve as many as 8 men a day. Journalists speculated that she might have had contact with as many as 4,000 men in her 3-year career in the former Yugoslavia. So Olena's death spread a panic throughout the region, and her body brought together people and places that had not been connected in any way since Yugoslavia fell apart in the early 1990s. Men who were in Belgrade in Serbia, in Celje in Slovenia, and then throughout Bosnia and Herzegovina were actually called to take an HIV test in the case that they had ever visited any of the bars where Olena had worked. Women's groups, gay and lesbian organizations, and NGOs working on women trafficking publicly lamented that things had to go as far as this young woman's tragic death to get the society and local politicians to pay any attention to women trafficking. Women and Society Center in Sarajevo organized a special forum about the media coverage of Olena Popic's case. And the participant argued that many of the local media outlets painted men as victims and Olena's deadly diseases kind of as the cause of their victimization. And they still referred to her as a prostitute, even though it was quite obvious that she was the victim of human trafficking and a white slave. At the time of Olena Popic's death, Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo were considered the ground zero in European human trafficking. International peacekeepers, including US contractors, Russian and Ukrainian soldiers, were both the principal customers and the key protagonists in women trafficking. Barracks invite brothels, wrote Sarah Mendelssohn, who later became an ambassador, in her very well-researched report on human trafficking in the Western Balkans. And indeed, they do. In November of 2004, Olena Popic's body was transported from Mostar to Dnepropetrovsk in a sealed casket. Her son, who was 3 years old at the time, is now probably somewhere fighting on the fronts of eastern Ukraine, if he has survived. So thinking about her amidst this war in Ukraine and renewed tremors in Western Balkans, I want to draw your attention to women who are invisible very often, like Olena Popic. I want to consider what their destinies can teach us and what can be done both conceptually, but also politically to change that. So let's talk a little bit about perspectives on war in international relations and then what feminist perspectives bring to them. So in international relations scholarship and in international politics, wars are usually viewed as manly affairs. Definitions limit wars to incidents of sustained combat involving substantial fatalities. Wars are understood as exclusively interstate conflicts. They have to be declared, soldiers have to be uniformed, and the toll must be at a minimum 1,000 battlefield deaths. So the key academic tabulators, and one of them is the Correlates of War Project at Pennsylvania State University. They have recently expanded these data sets to include non-state entities, colonial dependencies, intrastate wars, and militarized international disputes which fall short of war. But nonetheless, the analysis of war trends usually focus only on this very narrow definition. And they have led some scholars to conclude that actually the number of wars has been declining, that we live in these very happy times. So a decade ago, in the middle of the Syrian war, Steven Pinker at Harvard argued that we were living in the most peaceful period in the history of our species. And at about the same time, Joshua Goldstein, who actually knows something about feminism, despite wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, wrote that the early 20th century saw fewer war-related deaths than any period in the previous 100 years. There are people who advocate these narrow definitions because they believe that such conceptual constraints are actually crucial for distinguishing war from other acts of violence. There's something to be said to that. They also argue that separation of soldiers and civilians is necessary for protection of civilian lives and of the rules of war in humanitarian law. At the same time, these very narrow definitions also encourage acts of plausible deniability to powerful states. So you have these moments of undeclared aggressions, short interventions which do not require any kind of approval of parliaments, remote proxy wars, reliance on the little green men and mercenaries, and so on. So with their fixation on battlefield deaths only, they obviously obscure the enormous scale of civilian victims, and with women in particular, and children, and the swelling of the world refugee population in the last decades. There are now 110 million refugees in the world, 6 times as many as in 1990s. So from wars to land grabs to housing crisis, Saskia Sassen is completely correct to say that this is the age of mass expulsions, and they are deeply embedded in the world economy. So feminist scholars offer a very different perspective on war and peace. First, feminist security scholars and feminist political economists emphasize continuums and circuits of violence and question these usual dichotomies of war and peace, economy and security, of domestic and international, of public and private. Gender, wrote Cynthia Cockburn, links violence at different points on the scale, reaching from the personal to the international, from home to backstreet, and to the maneuvers of the tank column and the sorties of the stealth bombers. battering and marital rape, confinement, dowry burnings, honor killings, genital mutilation, peacetime military rape, sequestration, prostitution, sexualized torture in war. They're all on this kind of a spectrum of violence connecting war and peace. Building upon the continuums and acknowledging the gender-based violence is also experienced by men and boys. Other feminist scholars have argued that violence is a manifestation of structural inequalities, and that it also constitutes gender norms. So self-harm among the veterans, for instance, is an indication again of this continuum. More men have committed suicides in Northern Ireland after the Good Friday Agreement than all the victims of the Troubles in Northern Ireland in the 1970s and 80s. US veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have taken their own lives en masse. Almost 30,000 of them. This is more than 3 times the number of those who have been killed in combat. Suicide is currently the second cause of death amongst post 9/11 veterans, accounting for almost 22.5% of their deaths. Therefore, and this is the second point that feminists bring to the table, feminist scholars also stress enduring and transformative aspects of wars. They analyze ways in which wars make and remake men, women, sexualities, and gender relations more broadly. Wars can reshape women activism and participation, but they can also entrench power agreements dominated by men even after the conflict ends. They profoundly alter economic landscape, they create new riches and destroy livelihoods with very serious consequences for gender division of labor. I'll say a little bit more about it in a few minutes. Wars also redistribute resources. They create new narratives of love and care, as well as of loss, mourning, heroism, and victimhood. In our work on international financial institutions in conflict and post-conflict settings, Jackie True and I have demonstrated that although IFI frameworks increasingly include measures that are sensitive to gender inequalities and to differences, such as gender budgeting, I wrote about it, they nonetheless exacerbate gendered differences. Such insecurities are often borne by women whose unpaid labor predominantly attends to human trauma and recovery, and whose paid labor is relegated in financing for the post-conflict reconstructions. Economic reconstruction typically privileges marketization and privatization of natural resources, physical infrastructure building, I'll once again repeat this in a few minutes, and other foreign investment opportunities that overall benefit men's jobs, creation of men's jobs, incomes and assets more than women's, even when we correct for that by age, race, or ethnicity. Third point, feminist scholars insist that war and peace must be understood as embodied phenomena. Now, this may seem like a completely obvious point, given the emphasis on battlefield deaths, and even those kind of very narrow definitions of wars. Yet, as my colleague Lauren Wilcox has persuasively argued, one of the deep ironies of security studies and conversations about wars and international relations is that while war is actually inflicted on bodies, bodily violence and vulnerability as the flip side of security are very often completely ignored. And because international relations scholarship conventionally theorizes bodies as outside politics and irrelevant to subjectivity, it fails to understand how bodies are enabling and generative of war and practices of political violence more broadly. So feminist scholars have shown how bodies of the missing, bodies in need of protection, bodies of suicide bombers and terrorists, bodies of women activists, bodies of dead soldiers, are all produced by conflicts and also generative of very different politics. They shape collective responses to crisis and they frame memories of war and violence. And in fact, the modern state itself and its related concepts of security, liberty, and property, as documented by Charlotte Epstein recently in her award-winning book, have all been built upon particular understandings of human body. So putting all of this together, continuums of violence, gendered and then embodied aspects of wars, we can see that from a feminist perspective, wars and their aftermath are neither temporally nor spatially isolated phenomena. They have lasting political and economic effects, particularly on gendered hierarchies, which often extend far beyond immediate war zones. So as Jackie True has argued, the deepening of these inequalities and inattentiveness to ways in which wars shape gender norms in post-conflict and post-conflict periods can then lead to increases in gender violence after the formal cessation of war, and then contribute to its repetition, to recidivism, and to endless circuits of violence. So by following bodies in and out of war zones, we do not only see different numbers of wars and victims, but we actually see an entirely different political and economic landscape and the global ecology of violence. So following the bodies, let's try to see what we can see. Let me give you just some examples of bodies that circulate through war zones. Since I mentioned peacekeepers earlier, I'll start with peacekeepers. So Ukrainian troops arrived in Bosnia in 1992 as a part of the UN peacekeeping mission. They were mostly positioned in eastern Bosnia, close to the border with Serbia. And a small Ukrainian contingent was in charge of one of the 6 UN safe areas, a small town in Bosnia called Žepa, which was then overrun by Serbian forces in July 1995, right after the genocide in Srebrenica. After the fall of Žepa, a number of Bosnian men who were leaders of the kind of armed resistance in town were killed and disappeared in a very similar way as in Srebrenica. Local population to this day, rightly or wrongly, suspects Ukrainians of very close links with the Serb army, and they attributed the surrender of the city to their history to the history of Serb-Ukrainian cross-border trafficking and trade. In the Ukrainian memory, on the other hand, Žepa is etched as one of the most successful operations of Ukrainian peacekeepers, as it made it impossible to repeat a similar ethnic cleansing that had taken place in Srebrenica. Beyond Bosnia, since 1995, more than 37,000 Ukrainian soldiers have participated in peacekeeping operations, from Kosovo to Angola to Lebanon. The Ukrainian military was the 3rd to the 5th largest contingent in the Iraq War. And prior to the war with Russia, that was the largest operation that the Ukrainian military had ever engaged in, Iraq War. So at least some of the men who are now dying in the trenches on the Eastern Front have actually been trained on other people's wars and on other people's bodies. And they blend into a grand scale of global peacekeeping industry, which over the past 70 years included more than 1 million men and women who have served under the UN flag. So many of them then move seamlessly from war to peace, to private security agencies, private security companies, and different forms of violence and security disguised as protection. And then that violence again travels with them, not only with combat, but we find it kind of easier to accept as peacekeeping and security. It ends up very, very well disguised. Another example, you can think about entire villages built in Bosnia by men and women who had worked in the Iraq War, okay, along with Ukrainians, servicing the US troops. So Aida Moore, my colleague, has described in his book, Empire's Labor, how present-day US military empire is really profoundly dependent upon a global army of labor that comes from countries which are as diverse as Bosnia, the Philippines, Turkey, India, Kenya, United Kingdom, Sierra Leone, Fiji, etc. In the Iraq War, they very often, American troops very often hired Pakistanis because they could negotiate food markets, but they didn't have to then deal with the Iraqis who were suspect of being potentially dangerous. But things are even more complicated because many of these Bosnians who went to Iraq to work, who worked on the US base and then went to Iraq and made money and came back and built these villages, had also worked in Iraq before the Yugoslav wars in the 1980s. When then peaceful Bosnia, considered a non-aligned part of non-aligned Yugoslavia, was supplying the labor and weapons to both Iraq and Iran during their endless war. And when that war ended in 1988, it was a tremendous blow for the Bosnian economy, which became completely dependent on the inflow of foreign currency on that continued violence between its two non-aligned friends. And even the most vulnerable are caught in the cobwebs of war and peace. More than 35% of care workers in the OECD countries are foreign-born. The world's wealthiest countries are aggressively recruiting healthcare workers, often in these world's most fragile places. The Philippines, we all know, has built a state strategy of export of its predominantly female labor force. A Filipina is a common name for housekeepers and care workers in a number of countries now, including Israel. But it was like that in Italy here decades ago when I lived here. But within Europe, it's the peripheral and conflict zones, Ukraine, Kosovo, Bosnia, and Moldova, which have also now built economies which revolve around remittances of refugees and women. Their healthcare sectors are totally depleted by departures of workers to the EU, Germany in particular. And with millions of Ukrainian women who are already working in Europe as caregivers, and then refugees since 2022, and with so many men who are killed or maimed or permanently damaged on the front, it becomes more than legitimate to ask who is going to care for them when the war ends, and how many more suicides are we going to see after this war. So, war economy. The movement of bodies in and out of war zones and the areas of alleged peace is a reminder that wartime economies have their own dynamics. During wars, production activities often shift towards military needs. Tanks are being made instead of tractors, weapons instead of machines, uniforms instead of dresses. Gender relations are always affected by these changes. So in World War II, women were drawn into factories while men went onto battlefields. When the war ended, women were sent back to home to make room for the veterans. So the 1950s and 1960s, the golden age of Bretton Woods and welfare state, were also the years of massive housewifeization, especially in Western Europe and in the United States. But World War II may have been rather unusual, as production activities accelerated in the United States and continued in many parts of Europe until the later stages of the war, when destruction replaced occupation. In the post-Cold War period, however, most wars were being built on implosions within states. They are localized and contained, militarily, politically, discursively. They were, as Mary Calder wrote, new wars, disputes over culture and identity, fought by paramilitary troops and private armies, and financed very often by drugs or human trafficking. But perhaps more aptly, Washington pundits in the 1990s, reflecting their obvious great power bias, called these wars teacup wars. And production activities in the teacups usually come to a complete standstill. With very few items produced for the market, economy in these post-Cold War conflict areas depends on trade, large and small, but almost always informal and shadowy. Carolyn Nordstrom, Peter Andreas, Michael Pugh have done some fantastic research on the relationship between wars and illicit economies. What I would like to highlight here is a distinction between large-scale trade, which happens in these war zones, and informal economies of survival and social reproduction, because they have the most obvious gendered consequences. So there are four big items that go in and out of war zones: arms, food, fuel, and money. So the arms first. They never travel legally, even under the best circumstances. But in the aftermath of the Cold War, when even that kind of pretense of transparent armed transfers under the guise of solid alliances was completely gone, armed trade exploded, and it was very often completely illegal. Vast inventories of arms, especially in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, and in the motherboard of Russia, were up for grabs. And these weapons, and they often included very large systems like air defenses, were bought and sold with huge markups on prices and in the under-the-table deals. They were also logistically very difficult to deliver and continue to be logistically very difficult to deliver. So their movement depends on transport networks, protection rackets, and then substantial bribes to those who handle them along their routes, very often including other states and other officials. Those who trade in weapons and therefore control life and death in war zones very often emerge as wealthy individuals and backbones of state security apparati in post-conflict periods, if they survive. Because violent settling of accounts is very common among these merchants of debt, and it contributes to further instabilities after conflicts are over. The second item, food, is equally important. We usually don't think about it, but it's just as important. An Ottoman economic historian, Şevket Pamuk, who's just a fantastic economic historian, has written that for governments in power during periods of war, securing the food supply, and for the urban areas in particular, and for the military, has been one of the most important economic problems. So food procurement and the logistics of its movement and delivery often fall in the hands of men who were previously small traders, who used to bring agricultural products to markets because they know the roads, they know the checkpoints, they're acquainted with others who are willing to trade across enemy lines. And in wartime, they become wholesalers. You know, they just, instead of bringing a few tomatoes, they bring them en masse. So in the aftermath of wars, at least in the former Yugoslavia, these guys built huge supermarket empires, traversing state borders as if the wars had never happened. But even here in Italy, I just saw the other day at Feltrinelli, there is a recent book about the Caprotti family, who were the owners of Esselunga markets. They also similarly built their wealth in World War II, and then in the Italian Cold War, with CIA money, built this supermarket empire. The third big ticket item is fuel. It's essential for the military, and it's also needed in large quantities. And very much like arms, it requires very complex logistics, securing the pipelines, tankers, cisterns, storage places. It's also a very important source of funding because it can be rerouted and traded, often involving neighboring countries and their state apparati and their criminal networks. So I don't need to dwell on it here, you all know it. It has played a crucial role in every single recent conflict. But not only as a kind of an object of conflict, which is how we usually think about it, but also as a kind of a non-human agent that construed both war zones and zones of peace afterwards. And then finally, we don't usually think about money, but money is also a commodity in war. And local money, local currency in war zones very often becomes quickly obsolete. Central banks vanish often in war zones. Printing machines stop. So that money that you used to have before, the local currency, has to be exchanged for some other different foreign hard currency or other tradable and valuable items, such as gold or diamonds. In Yugoslavia, cigarettes played that role. They were the currency. And one of the most fascinating moments in the Yugoslavian war was actually kind of a swap of the Yugoslav dinars by the Slovenian government and Slovenian elites for Deutschmarks. They searched all over Europe for places where they could do that, like deliver these bags of money and then get hard currencies. And when they did that, then they dumped the dinars onto Bosnians and the Croats who still needed them and were still using them, and then used the profits that they made to become the major arms traders for Bosnia and for Croatia, which were under the arms embargo. And most of those arms were purchased in Russia and in Ukraine. So these big items, these big, ticket items, they also have their counterpart in trade that little people engage in for daily survival. So they trade in scraps of food, canisters of water, canisters of oil. But that trade is very often in the hands of women who buy and sell household items, and sometimes themselves, in order to secure the livelihood of their families in the wartime. So in two relatively recent RIPE articles, Jenny Mathers and Delia Dolan have documented the role of women in Ukraine, especially in the conflict areas of Eastern Ukraine, and in provisioning for their loved ones. Because the war in Ukraine, which did not start in 2022, but much earlier, so in that period of the invisible war with Russia after 2014, though monitored by the International Monetary Fund, it was mostly women who were kind of sacrificing themselves for the men who were in the battlefields, and played a major role in support of their families, equipping soldiers, mending uniforms, collecting wood for fuel amid rising energy prices, etc. So to sum it up, there is a very complex gender dynamic to this merchant economy that emerges in war zones. And my description is just a sketch, but I think it gives you the gist. What happens through war is that you usually have a handful of men who emerge from wars as enormously wealthy, but require a lot of violence to secure their positions. even in the post-conflict period. While women, on the other hand, are the ones who hold daily life together by trading skills and services themselves, and very often in the informal sector. So the recovery plans, which I had already mentioned, which focus on infrastructure and favor male employment, just add to this gender division of labor that has actually been created through the war. What saves women very often in post-conflict places is that humanitarian industry favors young women, good looking, with language and with administrative skills. And since production may or may not be restored, production as in production activities in the economy, it depends on the duration of the conflict. In some cases, it becomes completely obsolete because if you're in war for 4 or 5 years, you have to start from scratch. The war zones are then integrated into the global economy through these trading networks, revealing the degree to which the contemporary global economy and contemporary capitalism themselves actually dominated by merchants, with a regime of accumulation which is characteristic of commercial capitalism. So merchant economy, or commercial capitalism, if you would like, although they should be kept analytically distinct, has recently come into focus mostly because of its historical importance. So in the last decade, intense conversations about racial capitalism, sexual divisions of labor, multicultural origins of global political economy, non-Western agency, they have all reignited conversations about the role that slavery and commerce played in primitive accumulation and transition to capitalism. We have no time tonight to review these debates, and there are some fascinating pros and cons in there. But these debates have also crystallized 2 important points about, again, relevant for us today. First, they highlight the global character of the global political economy way before globalization. Trade in Indian Ocean, Silk Road, Venetians, significant of large merchant companies, like the Dutch VOC, but also merchant families in the diasporas, Jews, Armenians, Orthodox, Chinese. Second, they question identification of capitalism with British industrialization. In his recent book, Jairus Banerjee's, he reminds us that commercial capitalism has very often been totally overlooked, especially in Marxist circles. So Marxian political economists have tended to equate capitalism with industrial production only. This was the site of exploitation. And this productivist bias has also haunted open market economy approaches because despite their firm belief in free trade, they have usually also neglected the role of commercial actors and networks and sometimes large-scale monopolies that make that trade possible. And all of this matters, I would argue, not just for our understanding of historical transitions to capitalism, but then also for the way that the economy works today. Until quite recently, global trade volumes were outpacing increases in global production. Or to put it simply, for those who are not economists here, more goods were moving around, making money and profits than they were manufactured. And that movement was not happening magically or in political vacuums. Under the banner of global supply chains and global value chains, which is the language we now use, the world's largest corporations have actually been operating as gigantic trading companies, trading precisely those commodities that are also most demanded in wars. Wholesalers were designing and branding products, making orders, brokering sales, and then swiftly moving and reshaping production sites and marketplaces. And while merchant economy matters for our understanding of the locations and the logistics of power in international political economy, its spatial arrangements, its sensitive points, it also matters for the understanding of contemporary gender relations, racial relations, and the role of violence in the sustenance of the contemporary international order. By linking bodies, war, peace, and merchants, through the sinews of war, as Laleh Khalili has put it, we can more easily envision the scale of contradictory impulses for profit generation on the one hand and securitization on the other. Wars and borders, but also places of suspended sovereignty like conflict spaces, like the Western Balkans, where I come from, like very gendered, failed and fragile states sometimes also called courtesan states, they offer tremendous opportunities for arbitrage. They are also sites through which these illicit flows of trade can go on. And as we have experienced just recently after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and on a scale far more obvious than in any of those little teacup wars, wars enable profits through hike prices, through the price hikes, through real or exaggerated supply bottlenecks, and through war-induced shortages, especially of food, fertilizers, and energy. So merchant economy then creates a very different gender regime than feminist political economy often highlights. Because of its affinity to Marxian interpretations of economy, feminist political economists have also often been wedded to this productionist understanding of capitalism. They usually focus on the development of sexual divisions of labor associated with the advent of industrial capitalism, which domesticated women, limiting their labor to home, to non-wage, to invisibility. Social reproduction is also most often defined in relation to production, but not to capitalist economy more broadly. However, we know very well that the simplified story of wage and non-wage labor no longer holds, and perhaps it never did for many parts of the world outside of the industrialized North. Just as in the old putting out system, women often labor and produce goods from home. They are street vendors, they work in service industries. In fact, they're often prepared in many of these jobs. They're engaged in agriculture, they work in finance, they have nimble fingers. So as Donna Haraway noted years ago, they have been essential in the electronics industry for decades now. Women are also engaged in sex work, which has both morphed and expanded over time due to globalization and technological change. But it was also there in the early globalization. Because mobile and expatriate workforce and tourists, much like soldiers and peacekeepers, they all generate a need for sexual services. So in short, women are actually everywhere. They're not necessarily as invisible as we often think. And it's their presence everywhere that actually generates resentments. So consider, for instance, Wolfgang Streeck's view that women have been allies of the employers seeking labor market deregulation to allow outsiders to undercut male insiders. According to Streeck, the growth in female employment was also closely bound with simultaneous changes in family structure. The divorce rates have increased and marriage has become less common, as did children. And with more children found themselves, and as more children found themselves in unstable family relations, which has further augmented the female labor supply. So then he concludes that women in particular gain social prestige by combining Kinder und Karriere, children and a career, even if that career is being a supermarket cashier. So along with demographic fears and fantasies, which plague now global North, it is this really the overpresence of women in the economy that underlines much of the current anti-gender politics and politics in global North, demanding policies that would once again bring women back home to have more babies and accept their place and stop asking for more. Okay. So I'm coming to closure. I started this talk with a desire to understand the deep tensions and contradictions of the contemporary political moment, and with a story about a young Ukrainian woman, Olena Popik, whose options for economic survival were intimately linked to her own physical destruction. 2 decades after Olena Popik's death, we can see other patterns as well, especially from a feminist perspective. Just a year after Olena Popik's death, the US Department of Defense added a statute to the Uniform Code of Military Justice prohibiting patronizing prostitutes, and it became the first federal agency in the US to require its personnel to take training on trafficking of persons. Thanks to the recognition of sexual violence against women in the Bosnian War, and then criminalization of women's victimhood and widespread human trafficking elsewhere, the pets have been paid for the US Women, Peace and Security Agenda, for the UN Millennium and Sustainable Goals, and for a broadening of gender-sensitive objectives, which have now expanded under gender mainstreaming platforms in many international organizations and in the EU, encouraging introduction of gender quotas in parliaments around the world, and they have aided, obviously, advances in LGBTQ rights. But at the same time, through a combination of politics of pity and politics of risk, women were perceived primarily as victims in need of care and empowerment, and simultaneously constituted as threats and challenges to societies and economies in flux. This was particularly obvious in migration, where, as our colleague Claudia Aida has argued, humanitarian discourse, which attempts to save lives, has been appropriated within a securitizing discourse where migrants, boat people, asylum seekers, or trafficked women are integrated in a continuum of danger, equivalent to the continuums of violence. As a very liberal Dutch member of European Parliament told me in the 2000s, mid-2000s, if we do not have a strict visa regime, how are we to save Ukrainian women from being trafficked? And eventually, these policies declaring protection of trafficking victims would fortify European borders, leading to the deaths in the Mediterranean, detention camps, repatriation to third countries, and the funding of various authoritarian regimes on Europe's peripheries as the holding pens for refugees and for migrants. And yet, it's very difficult to imagine how millions of dollars which are being poured into border control, raids and brothels, victim assistance, even incarceration of owners and pimps would have actually altered the choices that Olena Popic faced. It's relatively easy to understand, on the other hand, how good schools, regular pension payments to her parents, and freedom to work and study in Europe would have made it much less likely that Olena Popic would become a candidate for sexual exploitation in the Bosnian slums in 2000s. And so herein lies a little bit of hope, even in this deeply, profoundly distressing moment. As another war rages in the European neighborhood, which this time we can't that easily contain in a teacup. First, we would probably be well advised to adopt these feminist perspectives on the continuums of violence and recognize the interdependence of contemporary capitalism with wars and crisis. There is really no wishful thinking, and there are no quick interest rate fixes that can alter the structural relationship between very fluid, infinitely resilient, movable merchant economy and perpetual political instability. Second, there is a lot to be learned from emphasis that feminists put on political economy of gender-based violence and structures that uphold it, from research on depletion of resources, both material and emotional, through politics of austerity and through extractivism. And most importantly, I think, from research on economies of care. Care is no longer the domain of non-wage labor, yet it is still almost entirely feminized. And it is indispensable to social, not just individual survival. If we were to combine childcare, healthcare, and care for seniors, it would be one of the fastest growing economic sectors. And women and women's bodies are the ones who are still holding it together. At the moment, care is aggressively privatized and made even more exclusive in many parts of the world. But it could be otherwise. It could be prioritized, even within the straitjackets of contemporary war capitalism. So feminist political economy, I would argue, offers both a more realistic picture of contemporary political economy, and also by shifting priorities, by pushing our glance elsewhere to the huge swaths of the economy in which usually women dwell, it offers an opportunity to get out. So let me conclude with Ursula Hirschmann. In 1941, imprisoned by Mussolini on an island off the coast of Lazio, a group of young anti-fascist intellectuals wrote for their hopes for Europe after World War II, which was not World War II at the time yet, the Ventotene Manifesto. And Ursula Hirschmann, whose husband was one of the imprisoned men, smuggled that document, Ventotene Manifesto, which was written on scraps of cigarette paper, legend says, and she helped to disseminate it through the anti-fascist struggles throughout Europe in the 1940s. Looking at Europe from without, from an open-air prison, the authors of the Ventotene Manifesto saw a continent which was ruined by imperial impulses of nation states and by the deeply inequitable, even gendered nature of their politics. They wrote, women are considered merely as producers or soldiers, or as producers of soldiers, and they are awarded prizes in much the same way as they are awarded to prolific cattle. Repeated wars force men to abandon families, jobs, property, often demanding the ultimate sacrifice for reasons of which no one really understands the value. So the new Europe, they argued very forcefully, had to be free and united and equitable. Economic redistribution and social ownership would have to replace harmful monopolies and fascist practices of corporatism. Along with her family, Ursula Hirschmann devoted her life to the idea of Europe with no borders, which would be hospitable to people like herself, senza patria, déracinée, or stateless. We can only love, she wrote, not because we are good, not because we are religious, but because that's the only way to remain in reality. Europe has obviously united since the Ventotene Manifesto. But I would say that it has failed its authors, and it has also failed Ursula Hirschmann. And if it is to survive and to again offer hope amidst wars, Europe must learn how to look at itself as a feminist and as a stateless person, and from the open-air prisons that it has now built on its edges and throughout its peripheries. I'm not naive enough to ask for demilitarization, to end of all conflicts, or even for disarmament. I think we are too far along the path of war capitalism at this point to return. But I will conclude by saying that I do urge you to just follow the bodies when thinking about the global political economy, and perhaps consider writing a new Ventotene Manifesto. Thank you.